Breaking news this Monday night, tariff deadline delayed. The last-minute deal between the Canadian Prime Minister and the U.S. President to avert a trade war for now. What it means for the stock market mayhem and calls to buy Canadian and boycott American.
We have to respond in kind.
Plus, how the provinces are responding to the tariff threat. And where does it leave the long-standing relationship between Canada and its closest neighbor?
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. With just hours to go before U.S. tariffs were set to take effect at midnight, news of a last-minute deal to delay a potential trade war for at least 1 month. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and U.S. President Donald Trump spoke twice by phone today. Trudeau says proposed tariffs will be paused for at least 30 days while we work together. He says Canada is implementing a $1.3 billion border plan with a list of specific measures to improve border security. That agreement confirmed moments later by Trump, who says the tariffs announced Saturday will be paused for a 30-day period to see whether or not a final economic deal with Canada can be structured. We have team coverage of this major breaking story tonight from Ottawa, Washington, and across the country. And we begin in our nation's capital, where Trudeau broke that news of a tariff reprieve. It comes as Canadians and their political leaders across the country were bracing for the devastating economic consequences and preparing their response. David Akin joins us now from Ottawa with more on the details from the phone calls and the big announcement. David.
Yeah, Jeff, it's been quite a day. Listen, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had been trying to get Donald Trump on the phone ever since Trump's inauguration, but Trump wasn't taking Trudeau's call until today, when Trudeau and Trump talked not just once, but as you mentioned, twice. The first call was early in the morning. The second call was around 3 Eastern. And then at about 4:45, Trudeau posted on social media that after what Trudeau called a, quote, good call with Trump, tariffs will be paused for at least 30 days.
Details are still sketchy, but Trudeau says Canada will appoint a fentanyl czar, even though U.S. Customs intercepted less than 50 pounds or 20 kilograms of fentanyl on its northern border last year. In fact, that was less than 1% of all the illegal fentanyl intercepted by the U.S. Trudeau made several other commitments to hardening the Canadian side of the northern border, including committing 10,000 frontline personnel to border protection. Trudeau also said Canada will list cartels that produce fentanyl as terrorists. Now, that kind of listing will give Canadian law enforcement additional tools to monitor, investigate, and punish anyone connected with illegal fentanyl production. Trudeau also committed Canada to spending an additional $200 million to combat organized crime and launched a Canada-U.S. Joint Strike Force. All day and all weekend, the country's premiers continued to announce measures they were prepared to initiate against U.S. interests. Many had said American firms would no longer be able to bid on provincial contracts. Many were ready to pull American booze from provincially run liquor stores. But now, Ontario's Premier Doug Ford said his province, which buys $1 billion worth of American wine, liquor, and beer every year, would also pause that retaliatory measure for now. Earlier in the day, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre said border security should be Canada's top priority.
Immediately deploy military troops, helicopters, and surveillance to the border to spot and intercept risks.
Now, Poilievre backs a tough dollar-for-dollar tariff war, but he also says Canada should be responding to the threat of tariffs by rapidly reducing interprovincial trade barriers.
Here we are trying to save our trade with another country while we can't even trade with ourselves.
Now, the Prime Minister did not speak to reporters today. He did convene a meeting of his Cabinet Committee on U.S.-Canada relations, presumably to determine next steps. Public Safety Minister David McGuinty, he'll be at a border crossing in Manitoba tomorrow, where we expect him to sketch out some of the details of Canada's new border protection plan. Jeff.
Okay, and as we know, the Trudeau government had promised more than $1 billion for border security weeks ago, David. So do you have any sense of whether these funds will make any actual difference at the border?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Jeff. You know, we're getting a new bureaucrat, this fentanyl czar. That kind of position is something Canada's really never had before. A czar is really creating a czar is really a very American approach to a problem. There's this joint task force, presumably of more bureaucrats. That funding, $1.3 billion, was announced in December. So It might make a difference, but more importantly, the White House believes it will make a difference. Jeff.
David Akin in Ottawa. Thanks, David. As David mentioned, Canada wasn't the only country to receive a reprieve from the tariffs. Hours earlier, Mexico also secured a delay from American trade action after making similar promises over its border with the U.S. It all made for a chaotic day, including in Washington, where Trump kept everyone on edge. Jackson Prosco joins us now from Washington. Jackson.
Hi, Jeff. Well, both Canada and Mexico have been trying to figure out what exactly Donald Trump is really after. Even in his announcement tonight, he mentions reaching a final economic deal. No one is sure what that might possibly look like. What is clear after today is that Trump really just wanted to be able to deliver a win.
We're not treated well by Canada.
From the White House, another day of mixed messages from President Donald Trump on the eve of the trade war he started.
I'd like to see Canada become our 51st state. We give them protection, military protection. We don't need them to build our cars. Banks aren't allowed to do business in Canada. We can't let them take advantage of the U.S. They don't take our agricultural product for the most part.
Just hours before his tariffs were supposed to come into effect, Trump remained unclear about what he was demanding from Canada.
President Trump was absolutely 100% clear that this is not a trade war.
Top advisors spent the day insisting this is still about the minuscule amount of fentanyl seized at America's northern border.
So I don't know how somebody reads the executive order if you're Canada and then comes back and says, oh, we're going to start a trade war. We're saying we're really, really serious about going after fentanyl, and President Trump means it.
That truly was the case for Mexico, where Trump announced a one-month tariff reprieve after a conversation with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. It was a good conversation with a framework of respect, she said. In exchange, Mexico agreed to send 10,000 National Guard troops to the border. Sheinbaum told Trump the U.S. needs to deal with illegal guns flowing into Mexico. A serious issue, she said. The uncertainty and Trump's strategy are unprecedented in the North American Trade Pact.
Washington's hair has been on fire this weekend.
Experts remain baffled by Trump's unprovoked threats to shred a trade deal he signed.
I mean, trade associations, businesses, everybody working nonstop to try to figure out, economic damage, what was on the line, how to avoid this, what does this really mean, how would this work in practice?
As we so often say, there's a huge gulf between what Trump says and what he actually does at the end of the day. And the question that will be being asked tonight in both Ottawa and in Mexico City is, what was it that finally convinced Trump to bend here? Was it the fact that the markets appeared to blink this morning? Or was it as simple as being able to give Trump something that he could actually claim as a win? Jeff?
Jackson Prosco in Washington. Thanks, Jackson. And as Jackson mentioned, the day began with a sell-off on North American stock markets as investors weighed the impact of potentially crippling tariffs. And Gaviola reports on the roller coaster for the Canadian economy and what lies ahead.
Investors view it as a trade war. Stock markets sold off, our loonie tumbled.
We're not going to sugarcoat it. It's really not a good economic outcome.
BMO says the tit-for-tat levies could push inflation in Canada another 0.5 percentage point higher and could tip our economy into a recession. RBC says this could push unemployment 3% higher. A tariff is a tax, extra money for federal coffers, paid for initially by the importer and also ultimately by the consumer.
U.S. is a big market for us in terms of expansion, and we were seeing a lot of growth there. So it's definitely disappointing that that may be hampered.
Encircled is a slow fashion brand made in Toronto. CEO Christy Sumer anticipates less sales to American customers who'll have to pay that tariff and more delivery holdups.
It's just going to also increase the volume of packages being assessed at the border, and that's a lot of labor to do that and a lot of time.
The new tariffs, a significant challenge on top of mounting costs and supply chain issues.
The cost of labor has gone up, the cost of materials has gone up.
The trust in this relationship is broken.
Observers say this upsets the long-standing relationship between Canada and its largest trading partner, casts a shadow on capital looking to invest in our economy.
Businesses are holding back investment in Canada for a number of years going forward.
Lost opportunity cost at a time when our economy could use a boost. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
If the U.S. moves forward with tariffs next month, the Canadian government has pledged retaliatory tariffs of 25%, targeting a long list of American products, from beer and wine to baby clothes to vacuum cleaners. A full list is available on our website, globalnews.ca. The federal government has said those countermeasures will only come into effect if and when the U.S. tariffs are applied. The sector likely to be hardest hit by a trade war is Canada's automotive industry. It contributes around $18 billion a year to Canada's GDP, and the industry supports 500,000 Canadian jobs. Trump repeated again today that the U.S. doesn't need cars from Canada, but his claim overlooks the fact that vehicles are assembled in both countries, with parts crisscrossing the border around 6 times before a vehicle rolls off the line. Our Shallima Maharaj visited one family-run parts plant whose livelihood is on the line.
Going to be a big problem.
Casey Vasudeva has been in the automotive industry for close to 50 years. He's no stranger to weathering a storm or two, but this one.
He's doing this to us.
Vasudeva is the founder of Max Tech Innovations, which manufactures vehicle components. 80% of what gets made in this Etobicoke warehouse goes to the U.S.
It's terrible. Right now, we have a contract we got 3 weeks ago, $1 million for a year, so 5-year contract. So I won't be competitive anymore with the duty, so I will have to decline on that contract.
Vasudeva has just under 50 employees working here, and they too are nervous. He's in the midst of other contract negotiations, but ultimately believes government support will be essential to helping small businesses stay afloat during a Canada-U.S. trade war.
We don't need them to make our cars.
Trump doubling down on his position Monday afternoon after more talks with the Prime Minister. Speaking at a manufacturing facility just north of Toronto, the president of the Auto Parts Manufacturers Association says they're not seeking out financial aid just yet.
This is probably the similar situation to the COVID shutdown in March 2020 and the Ambassador Bridge blockade in February 2022. You can't make a car without all the parts.
Meantime, Global Automakers of Canada President David Adams says our members are gravely concerned. This will have immediate negative impacts to jobs and consumers on both sides of the border. Tariffs only serve to increase costs, hinder trade, impact economic growth, and hurt consumers and workers. As for Casey Vasudeva, he suggests business owners sit down and have a conversation with their American buyers.
We have no issue with American people. 2 of my daughters live in USA, so I can't complain about the USA.
Shallima Maharaj, Global News, Toronto.
The potential tariffs fueling Canadian patriotism. Coming up, the growing push to buy Canadian and boycott American, and whether it's sustainable. Plus, the salvage operation now underway after an aviation disaster. On this busy day of tariff talk, Trump still managed to carve out some time to host the Stanley Cup champions at the White House. 7 Canadian players and Ontario coach Paul Maurice helped the Florida Panthers beat the Edmonton Oilers to win the Cup last June. The Stanley Cup's home, of course, is in the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto. Toronto Raptors fans voicing their anger over the proposed U.S. tariffs, booing the American anthem at last night's game and captured by the Toronto Star. And the chorus of boos continued at the Canucks game in Vancouver.
Can you see by the dawn's early light?
And Canadians are also protesting those proposed tariffs with their wallets, with many consumers changing their shopping lists and travel plans to avoid American goods and destinations. But does buying Canadian really make a difference? Heather Yourex-West went to find out.
At this Calgary pub chain, American alcohol has been booted from the bar.
As Canadians, I think we all have to support Canada with Team Canada, and right now that means avoiding American-made products.
It means no more Tennessee whiskey or Budweiser beer, as long as Canada remains under U.S. tariff threat. Angry Canadian grocery shoppers now checking labels carefully too.
I'm going to take the oranges instead of the apples because they're from Spain. So good for EU, good for Mexico, too bad for the U.S.
We have a friend in the South who suddenly is no longer a friend. And I don't understand the rationale behind the tariffs. Unfortunately, he's brought it to the table, so we have to respond in kind.
There may be benefits to buying Canadian and boycotting things like American beer. It feels good taking a stand with our own personal spending power. But can it pack a big enough economic punch? Well, that depends on who you ask.
It's noble in spirit, but it's foolish in practice. We buy American goods and services because we get better quality for the same price, or the same quality for lower price.
It's why this economist says boycotts typically don't last long, because they can be expensive to sustain.
I'm a proud Canadian, and I want to support anything that to get a sort of this thing with the tariff.
For those determined to keep their dollars from U.S. coffers, experts say let the Made in Canada logo be your guide, though not all products can be locally sourced.
To me, it's less about buying Canadian, which is good, and more about not buying American, and that's a distinction.
It's why back at Jameson Pub, the Mexican beer is here to stay. A cheers and solidarity at the start of what could be a long trade war. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
Still ahead, officials in LA get creative to remove an unwanted house guest. Severe flooding is swamping parts of Australia. Rivers and reservoirs have overflowed in North Queensland. At least one person there has died. Many residents in low-lying areas are being helped to higher ground. 2,000 homes could be affected. More than 6 months of rain has fallen there in just the past 3 days. Crews began removing wreckage from the Potomac River near Washington, D.C., 5 days since that deadly mid-air collision between an American Airlines passenger jet and a military helicopter. More than 300 responders are now taking part in that delicate recovery effort. Authorities have so far found and identified 55 of the 67 people killed in that crash. There were no survivors. A utility crew in California made a frightening find. A 525-pound bear was hiding under a house in the greater Los Angeles area. That bear had apparently fled the wildfires and was discovered in the home's crawl space. It took wildlife officials nearly 24 hours to lure the bear out of the house using an assortment of food, including a rotisserie chicken, apples, butterscotch, and peanut butter. The well-fed bear was then trapped, tagged, and released into the nearby national forest.
This ain't Texas. Ain't no hold'em.
Queen Bee wins big. Coming up, the history-making highlights from the Grammys as Beyoncé snaps a losing streak. A big moment for music superstar Beyoncé at the Grammys last night. After a record 99 nominations throughout her career, she finally won Album of the Year for her country debut, Cowboy Carter. Canadian Dave Hamlin worked as a producer, engineer, and mixer on that album. And rapper Kendrick Lamar swept 5 categories, including Song of the Year and Record of the Year, all for his chart-smashing track, Not Like Us, which takes aim at Toronto rapper Drake. And it was also a big moment today in the history of relations between Canada and the U.S. The two countries have a deep and long-standing partnership that's being tested in a new way. As Eric Sorensen reports, Trump's threatened rollout of tariffs has shaken Canada's trust in our closest neighbor.
The Gordie Howe International Bridge will open this fall between Windsor and Detroit. Is there a greater symbol of what our two countries mean to each other? A border separates us. This brings us closer. Bridges and roads have always been a lifeline between two economies, two ways of life, two friends. Canadians cross the border more than 20 million times a year. Almost as many Americans visit here. We have so much in common. The language we speak, the sports we play, the foods we eat, the cars we drive, the jobs we have, the values we share. More than 100 years ago, Canadian and American soldiers honored the fallen near the Fort Erie Buffalo border. Every year, our veterans remember fighting together on the beaches of Normandy. And when the 9/11 attacks targeted America, the Canadian military joined the U.S. in Afghanistan, fought shoulder to shoulder, and died in that effort. There are differences and irritants, but Americans have always shown they value our friendship as we do theirs. What happened? The United States is the most powerful and richest country on earth, and somehow, suddenly, is disadvantaged.
The United States has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world.
And yet Canada, historically America's closest partner, is Donald Trump's primary target. It seems almost personal. He can do this country enormous harm, but tying knots in the bonds between us will cause pain on both sides of the border. And worse than just threatening our economy, he has shaken our trust. Not in Americans themselves, but in this government. Still, Trump has inadvertently given Canada new strength, a sense of unity and purpose to deal with the hardships and remain our own country. We're as close as any two allies in the world. A reprieve on tariffs does not end the dispute. We've been forced to stand up to our old friend to see our way through this. We're angry and maybe now a little relieved. We have a long history to keep in mind and a future to look out for. Let's not burn bridges. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Monday. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada is the Canada-U.S. border crossing between Sarnia, Ontario and Port Huron, Michigan, in this tumultuous moment for the world's longest undefended border. Thanks for watching. Donna will be back with you tomorrow. Have a great night.